On the morning Captain Larry Thorne disappeared, the helicopter was flying into one of the most dangerous places in Vietnam, and the men on board knew it. The mountains below them were steep, the weather was unstable, and the landing zone was in territory where getting in was already hard, and getting out could be impossible. When the aircraft went silent and vanished, it did not just take a soldier out of the war. It closed the final chapter on a man who had already lived through more war than most armies could survive. But to understand why Larry Thorne mattered, you cannot start with Vietnam. You have to start in Finland, in a country where winter was not just cold, but defining. It shaped movement, survival, discipline, and even character. Men who grew up there learned early that nature could be unforgiving, and that hesitation often cost more than courage. Larry Thorne came out of that world. He did not begin as a legend, and he certainly did not begin as a mystery. He began as a Finnish boy with a hard future and a country that would soon be forced into a fight for its life. Finland in the 1930s was small, vulnerable, and trapped between stronger powers. For a young man with Thorne's temperament, that environment mattered. He was not the kind of person who fit easily into ordinary life. He was restless, driven, physically capable, and drawn to action. Some men are built for stability. Others are built for crisis. Thorne belonged to the second group. That does not mean he was born heroic. It means that when history turned violent, he was one of the men who did not look away. Then came the Winter War. In 1939, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, and suddenly the struggle was no longer theoretical. The war was short, savage, and intensely personal for the Finns. This was not a distant campaign fought for slogans or ideology. It was a fight over homes, forests, roads, villages, and the right of a small country to remain itself. For a young Finnish soldier, that kind of war leaves a mark immediately. It strips away any romantic idea of combat and replaces it with something harsher, the knowledge that survival belongs to the men who can stay calm when everything around them is collapsing. Thorne proved himself in that environment. He was not the type of soldier who waited to be told how to react. He moved, assessed, and acted. He understood that in winter warfare, the man who reacts a second too late is already dead. That sounds simple, but in war, simplicity is often the difference between a survivor and a casualty. The Winter War gave him exactly the kind of education no academy could provide. It taught him how to operate under pressure, how to trust instinct, and how to stay functional in chaos. It also gave him something more important than skill. It gave him identity. Once a man has fought in a war that threatened his country's existence, he does not walk away unchanged. He starts to see himself through the lens of battle. He remembers who stood with him, who broke, who survived, and who never came back. That kind of memory does not fade easily. It becomes part of how a man understands loyalty, duty, and enemy. For Thorne, the Soviet Union was not a political abstraction. It was the force that had brought war to Finland. That mattered, because it shaped every decision that came after. Finland did not get the ending it wanted. The country survived, but the war left behind bitterness, fear, and a sense that the struggle was not really over. For men like Thorne, that unfinished conflict created a dangerous kind of momentum. They had learned how to fight, and they did not want to stop. They also had a reason in their own minds to keep looking eastward. This is one of the reasons his story is so difficult. People want history to sort itself into clean categories. But men like Thorne were formed in a world where the categories were already broken. He was not some naive volunteer wandering into a cause he did not understand. He was a soldier shaped by a national trauma. That does not erase the moral weight of what happened next. It only explains why the next step made sense to him at the time. When the door opened to serve in a larger anti-Soviet fight, he stepped through it. Not because he was a cartoon villain, and not because he was a simple patriot in the purest sense, but because war had already become the main grammar of his life. That is where the first major transformation begins. Thorn moved from defending Finland to fighting inside a larger and more brutal European conflict. He entered the German military sphere at a moment when the continent was being dragged deeper into total war. For many men, joining that machine was an act of ideology. For others, it was an act of desperation, ambition, or hatred of the Soviet Union. In Thorn's case, it was tied to all of those things in different proportions. But above all, it was tied to identity. He had become a soldier for whom the battlefield was the place where he made sense of the world. What separates Thorn from many other wartime figures is that he did not disappear into the role of anonymous infantryman. He kept rising because he was effective. He had the qualities armies notice quickly, even when they later want to pretend those qualities are easy to separate from politics. He was disciplined, aggressive, adaptable, and able to remain useful in situations where many others would have failed. That combination made him valuable. It also made him memorable. This is important because the best war stories are not built only on events. They are built on character under pressure. Thorn's early years matter because they explain why he did not break when others did. He learned patience in the snow, aggression in combat, and emotional restraint in a country that could not afford sentimental soldiers. He was not polished, he was not elegant, but he was dangerous in the way that matters on a battlefield. He could function when everything around him was falling apart. At the same time, there was a deeper contradiction already forming in him. The same man who would later be admired for military competence was moving toward affiliations that would forever complicate his legacy. That is what makes his story interesting. If he had been simply brave or simply evil, there would be nothing left to examine. But he was neither simple nor clean. He was a man whose personal sense of duty kept colliding with the historical reality around him. That tension is the heart of his life. And yet, even at this stage, he was still only beginning. The Finnish years created the foundation, but they did not yet reveal the full scale of what he would become. He had the physical traits of a soldier, yes, but more importantly, he had the psychological ones. He could endure discomfort without complaint. He could accept risk without theatricality. He could move from one chain of command to another if the mission demanded it. Those are not glamorous traits. They are the traits that keep a man alive long enough to become significant. That is why his story opens so well from the beginning. Larry Thorn was not born into legend. He was made by pressure. He was built in a country where winter punished weakness, then shaped by a war that made combat feel like destiny. Long before he became an American Special Forces officer, long before Vietnam, long before the final helicopter flight, he had already learned the most important lesson of his life. A soldier is not defined by the uniform alone, but by what he becomes when history gives him no safe place to stand. He was still young when the war ended, but war did not end inside him. That mattered, because the next phase of his life would not be a clean transition from one uniform to another. It would be a deeper descent into the logic of conflict, where every choice seemed temporary and every allegiance had a price. After Finland's struggle against the Soviet Union, Thorn was not the kind of man who could simply return to ordinary life and pretend that nothing had happened. He had already been shaped by violence, and men like that rarely fit back into peace without friction. They move differently. They think differently. They look at authority, borders, and enemies through a narrower but sharper lens. For Thorn, the war had not just taught him how to fight. It had taught him that the world could split overnight into survival and collapse. And once you have seen that clearly, it becomes hard to trust any system that promises safety without proving it. That is one reason his next step was so consequential. He entered the German war machine not as a naive dreamer, but as a man already hardened by one war, and now pulled into another. This is where the story stops being only Finnish and becomes something much larger and much darker. The choice to serve with the Germans cannot be separated from the anti-Soviet hatred that many Finns carried after the Winter War, but it also cannot be reduced to that alone. Thorn was not moving through history as a symbol. He was moving as a person who wanted to keep fighting, who understood war better than peace, and who saw the Soviet Union as the enemy that had already tried to destroy his country. The German side gave him something that peacetime Finland could not. It gave him scale. It gave him a larger battlefield, a more intense purpose, and the kind of military structure where a hard, capable man could rise quickly if he performed well. Thorne did perform well. That is one of the most uncomfortable facts about him. He was not a useless fanatic drifting through the chaos. He was effective, and effectiveness in wartime has a way of laundering doubt. Armies reward men who can get results, even when those results are morally contaminated. What makes this period so important is that Thorne was no longer fighting only for memory. He was now embedded in a conflict that had become total, ideological, and ruthless. The Eastern Front was not a place where moral purity survived for long. It was a machine that consumed everyone it touched. Thorne entered that machine with his own motives, but once inside, the scale of the war overwhelmed personal stories. Men were no longer simply soldiers. They were cogs in operations that stretched across continents and through layers of violence that ordinary language can barely contain. And yet, Thorne did not vanish into anonymity. He became the kind of soldier that others noticed. That says a great deal about him. He had a reputation for being hard, composed, and capable under pressure. He could absorb stress without turning theatrical. He was the man who stayed functional when conditions became ugly. That matters in war, because many men can fight when the moment looks dramatic. Far fewer can remain useful when the weather ruins the plan, the terrain is miserable, the chain of command is confused, and the enemy keeps coming anyway. There is also a psychological truth here that makes Thorne compelling. He was not chasing glory in the childish sense. He was chasing competence, authority, and movement. Men like that often appear cold to outsiders, but what they are really seeking is structure. Thorne understood the world through action. If he was given a mission, he would execute it. If the mission changed, he would adapt. If danger increased, he would lean into it instead of retreating from it. That is one of the reasons he could later survive a career that would have destroyed weaker men. At the same time, the moral ground beneath him was already cracking. This is where the story gains its tension. The same man who had been a Finnish defender against invasion was now serving a regime and a war effort that history would judge with far more brutality. That contradiction is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. People are drawn to Thorne because he cannot be simplified without losing the very thing that makes him worth telling. By the time the war reached its next phase, he had become the kind of man who belonged more to conflict than to any single national narrative. That does not mean he stopped being Finnish in any meaningful sense. It means that war had enlarged him and damaged him at the same time. He had seen enough to believe that survival required hard choices. He had also seen enough to know that hard choices do not stay clean. This is why his later life would be so unstable. Once a man has crossed the line between defending his country and serving within a much larger and more morally compromised war structure, he has entered a world where every future identity is contested. For Thorne, the post-war years would not erase that past. They would only force him to live with it in new forms. The war had given him skills, discipline, and confidence. It had also left him with a deeper need to keep proving himself. And that need matters, because men like Thorne are rarely driven by one emotion. They are driven by a stack of them: pride, resentment, loyalty, ambition, habit, and the fear of becoming ordinary again. After what he had lived through, ordinary life would have felt like a kind of decline. He was not built for quiet. He was built for stress. He was built for environments where a second of hesitation could decide everything. So, when the next stage of his life began, he was already carrying a full burden of experience. He had been a Finnish soldier, a wartime survivor, and now a man with a German wartime record that would later make his biography almost impossible to explain cleanly. He was the sort of figure history prefers to keep at the edge of the frame. because if you look too closely, the categories start to fail. But that is exactly why the story works. Thorne is not interesting because he was perfect. He is interesting because he was a man whose life kept moving toward greater contradiction. Each war made him more capable and more difficult to judge. Each uniform gave him a new role and a new problem. And every time it looked as though his path might settle into one simple identity, history pushed him somewhere else entirely. His return to Finland did not give him peace. It gave him a new battlefield. Only this one was quieter, more political, and in many ways, more dangerous. When the war ended, Larry Thorne was not the kind of man who could be folded back into civilian life and forgotten. Men like him do not simply stop being what they have become. They carry the war with them, not always in speeches or memories, but in instinct. Thorne had spent years learning how to survive in extreme conditions, how to make decisions fast, and how to trust only what had been proven under pressure. That made him useful in war and difficult in peace. Finland had changed, Europe had changed, and the role he had played in the conflict was no longer something that could be celebrated without hesitation. The first problem was obvious. Thorne had served on the German side during a war that left behind devastation, occupation, and crimes that no patriotic explanation could ever fully excuse. The second problem was more personal. He had fought for Finland, but the Finland he returned to was not the same country that had sent so many men into battle with a clear enemy. The front line was gone. The battlefield had shifted into politics, intelligence, surveillance, and suspicion. For a man like Thorne, who had lived in direct action, that kind of world felt unstable and humiliating. He was still dangerous, but now the danger had no clear target. That is often where veterans become unstable or invisible. Thorne became neither. He stayed active, restless, and deeply committed to the anti-Soviet cause that had shaped his wartime thinking from the beginning. He did not see the end of the war as the end of the conflict. He saw it as a pause in a struggle that had already entered a new phase. In his mind, the Soviet Union remained the same threat. Finland had survived, but it had not escaped history. That sense of unfinished business would define everything that came next. What makes this part of his story so compelling is that it reveals how war can continue after peace, in forms that are less visible but no less real. Thorne was not just a veteran returning home. He was a man trying to find a place in a country where the political temperature had changed, where old loyalties were now risky, and where silence was often safer than conviction. But Thorne was not built for silence. He moved toward anti-Soviet underground activity because it gave him a sense of purpose, and because it matched the worldview war had already carved into him. This is where the line between patriot and outlaw becomes blurred. To some, Thorne was still a Finnish soldier, acting out of loyalty to his country and fear of Soviet domination. To others, he was a dangerous extremist, refusing to accept the new reality. Both interpretations have weight. That tension is one of the reasons his life remains so powerful. He was not fighting for a neat ideology. He was fighting against the possibility, as he saw it, of Finland being absorbed, pressured, or silently reshaped by the Soviet sphere. Whether he was right or wrong politically, the emotional logic behind his actions was clear. He became involved in attempts to organize resistance networks and anti-Soviet activity inside Finland and beyond it. That did not make him a romantic rebel. It made him a man operating in the gray zone where intelligence, resistance, and subversion overlap. Those environments produce stories that are hard to simplify because they are full of men who believe they are defending a nation while others see them as destabilizing it. Thorne lived exactly in that tension. He was too committed to be neutral and too controversial to be safe. That eventually brought consequences. The Finnish state could not ignore a man like Thorne forever. He had already built a military reputation, but now that same reputation made him difficult to trust. A soldier who has been competent in war and politically unpredictable in peace becomes a problem for any government. Thorne was watched, judged, and eventually pushed into the category that changes a man's life. No longer merely a veteran, but a liability. Then came the arrest, and with it, the collapse of any illusion that his wartime service would protect him from the post-war order. The man who had once fought under Finnish colors now found himself treated as a threat by the country he had served. That is one of the most painful turns in the entire story, because it forces the audience to confront something uncomfortable. Nations do not always reward the men who fought hardest for them. Sometimes they punish them when the war is over and the political temperature changes. Thorne's response was not submission, it was resistance. He escaped. That detail matters because it reveals who he was at his core. He did not see confinement as a final condition. He treated it as an obstacle to be defeated. A man like Thorne is rarely more alive than when he is under pressure and forced to improvise. The escape only deepened his legend, but it also deepened the contradictions around him. Was he a loyal patriot resisting political persecution, or a dangerous man refusing accountability? The answer depends on who is telling the story. What is clear is that Finland could not hold him in any simple sense. The war had already changed him too much. He was no longer just a Finnish officer or a wartime volunteer. He had become a figure out of step with the post-war settlement, a man still wired for conflict in a world trying to rebuild itself around compromise. That mismatch is what drives his story forward, and it is the reason this chapter matters so much. Up to this point, Thorne has been defined by war, allegiance, and anti-Soviet conviction. But now the story is about to change again. The man who could not find peace in Finland will eventually be drawn into a completely new world, one that gives him a new uniform, a new mission, and a new identity. That transition will not erase the past, it will sharpen it. By the end of this phase, Larry Thorne is no longer just a Finnish soldier with a complicated wartime record. He is a man who has been tested by war, rejected by politics, and pushed to the edge of legality in a country that once needed him. He has survived military conflict, escaped captivity, and proven that he cannot be contained easily by institutions or borders. That is exactly why his next move will be so extraordinary. America did not discover Larry Thorne as a mystery. It discovered him as a man who had already survived the kind of life most soldiers never come close to living. By the time he arrived in the United States, Thorne was no longer just a Finnish veteran with a controversial past. He was a man built by war, rejection, and reinvention. That combination made him unusual, even before anyone knew the full story. In America, the military wanted men who could lead under pressure, think independently, and handle the unpredictable reality of modern conflict. Thorne had already been living that way for years. He was not learning those qualities in training. He was arriving with them already installed. What made this stage of his life so remarkable is that the United States did not see a clean biography. It saw a soldier with skill, discipline, and a strange intensity that could not be ignored. The past was complicated, but in the Cold War world, complication was often tolerated when usefulness was high. America needed men who understood the Soviet enemy, who had fought under harsh conditions, and who could operate with a level of toughness that could not be taught quickly. Thorne fit that need almost perfectly. He changed his name to Larry Thorne, and the change was more than administrative. It was an act of rebirth. The old life was still there, but now it was being pushed behind a new identity. That kind of transformation is never complete. The past remains in the body, in the reflexes, in the way a man carries himself, but a new name gives him room to move. It is also a warning. People who reinvent themselves often do so because the old world has become impossible to survive in. Thorne was one of those men. What follows is one of the strangest and most fascinating military reinventions of the 20th century. Thorne entered the American military world and proved once again that he was not just someone with an interesting backstory. He was the real thing. He had field experience, leadership ability, and a kind of hardness that made him valuable in special forces circles. These units were not interested in polish. They cared about whether a man could function in small teams, under pressure, in hostile environments, far from help. Thorne was exactly that kind of man. He did not need to perform toughness. He already was tough. That difference matters. Difference. A lot of people can imitate military confidence. Very few can carry the emotional weight that comes from actual exposure to war, defeat, exile, and survival. Thorne could. That made him credible to men who judged each other quickly and brutally. In an environment where reputation is built in the field, he earned respect because he had the one thing that cannot be faked: proven composure under fire. This is where the story becomes especially compelling. Thorne was not simply accepted into a new army. He adapted to a new national myth. America's special forces in the Cold War saw themselves as elite, flexible, and forward deployed against communist expansion. For Thorne, that mission made intuitive sense. He had spent much of his adult life seeing the Soviet Union as the central threat. So, in America, he found a new framework that did not require him to abandon his old instincts. It gave them a new direction. That is why his service in the United States is more than a footnote. It is the third major transformation in his life. First, he was a Finnish soldier. Then, he was a controversial wartime figure in the German orbit. Now, he was an American officer in a force designed for the very kind of unconventional warfare he understood instinctively. Each stage of his life did not erase the previous one. It piled on top of it. That made him more effective and more difficult to summarize. The most interesting thing about Thorne at this stage is that he became admirable in a professional sense without ever becoming simple. He could be respected by his peers and still remain a figure of moral discomfort to historians. That is part of why his story has such power. The audience is not being invited to approve of him. The audience is being invited to watch a man who keeps surviving history's most brutal turning points and keeps becoming something else in response. By the time he was serving with American Special Forces, Thorne had become exactly the kind of officer modern military institutions love and struggle to explain. He was pragmatic, relentless, and intensely mission-focused. He did not waste energy on sentiment. He believed in competence, loyalty inside the unit, and direct action. Those traits made him effective in a world that was moving toward proxy wars, covert operations, and endless conflict that never looked as clean as the slogans used to describe it. This also gives the chapter a major emotional engine, because the audience now sees a man who has already lived several lives, and yet still does not seem to belong anywhere completely. Finland made him. Germany used him. America repurposed him. But none of those identities fully solved him. That sense of unresolved belonging is what makes his biography feel alive. He is not a static historical figure. He is a man being constantly reassembled by history and by his own need to remain in motion. The Cold War gave him relevance again, and relevance mattered to him more than comfort ever could. He had spent too long in environments where survival depended on staying useful. America offered that. It also offered distance from the political wounds of Europe, though never enough distance to erase them. Thorne remained a man whose internal map of the world was drawn by wartime experience. The United States gave him an outlet for that identity, and for a time, it worked. But this stage of his life is not just about competence. It is about tension. Because the same man who had served in one of history's most morally compromised military systems was now wearing an American uniform and being treated as an asset. That contradiction is powerful, and it should not be softened. It is the core reason his story feels so unusual. Modern history does not often produce figures who can move across such different systems and remain operational in all of them. That is why the next part of his life, the one that ends in Vietnam, lands with such force. This chapter is the bridge. It shows how a Finnish soldier with a complicated past became an American Special Forces officer with a new name and a new mission. It shows how war can remake a man again and again until there is almost nothing left that belongs to a single country. And it leaves the audience with the right question. What happens when a man who has survived every previous war is sent into one last one, with no clean exit and no guarantee that history will remember him the way he remembers himself. On the morning Larry Thorne disappeared, the helicopter was flying into terrain that already had a reputation for killing men who made one mistake too many. The weather was bad, the mountains were unforgiving, and the mission was one of those operations where everyone involved understood that the margin for survival was thin. By then, Thorne had already lived several lives inside one lifetime. He had been a Finnish soldier, a German wartime volunteer, a fugitive, an anti-Soviet operator, and finally, an American Special Forces officer. Vietnam was not the beginning of his danger. It was the last test of a man who had built his identity by surviving the previous ones. By 1965, Thorne was no longer simply an unusual officer. He was a legend inside the small world that knew his name. The men around him understood that he was older than most of them, harder than most of them, and carrying more history than he ever talked about. He did not arrive in Vietnam as a clean Cold War hero. He arrived as a man whose entire life had been shaped by war, and who still seemed to live by the rules war had taught him decades earlier. That made him useful, respected, and difficult to fully know. What is important about this final chapter is that it does not end in a neat moral summary. It ends in disappearance, which is far more powerful. History loves men who return. It struggles with men who vanish. Thorne vanished in the mountains of Vietnam, and that fact gave the end of his life a kind of silence that fit him strangely well. He had always been a man of action more than explanation. He was not someone who built himself through speeches or self-justification. He built himself through movement, endurance, and function under pressure. That is why his final mission feels like the correct ending for a life like his. He had spent years being carried by history from one battlefield to another, and now he was being carried into the last one by the logic that had always governed him. Be useful, stay sharp, trust the mission, do the work. There is a terrible irony in that. The same qualities that made him exceptional also made him vulnerable to being consumed by the kind of war that never gives clean answers. The helicopter never came back. Search efforts followed, but the jungle and mountains of Vietnam had a way of swallowing men and refusing to return them. For his family, his comrades, and the military world that had come to value him, there was no dramatic closure. There was only absence. And absence can be more haunting than death, because it leaves the story open in the worst possible way. A body can be buried. A disappearance can only be carried. That silence at the end matters, because Thorne's whole life had been moving toward it. He had spent decades becoming a man who belonged fully to no single national memory. Finland could claim his early courage, but not his later choices. Germany could claim his wartime service, but not the meaning of his life. America could claim his final rank and service, but not the full burden of his past. He was always too much and too little at the same time. Too capable to be dismissed, too compromised to be made simple, too useful to be ignored, too contradictory to be neatly honored. And yet, that contradiction is exactly what makes him memorable. A lesser story would try to clean him up. It would remove the uncomfortable parts and present him as a straightforward warrior. But that would flatten everything that makes him worth telling. Thorne's life is powerful because it forces the audience to hold two truths at once. He was a man of real courage, real discipline, and real battlefield competence. He was also a man who moved through some of the most morally compromised environments of the 20th century. You cannot understand him if you choose only one side. That tension is what gives his death in Vietnam its final force. He did not die in a simple war. He died in a war where nothing was simple. By then, the world had become smaller, more chaotic, and more suspicious of the very kind of men Thorne represented. The age of clear front lines was fading. The age of covert conflict, special operations, and endless proxy struggle was beginning. Thorne belonged to that world, not because he was modern in a neat sense, but because he was already formed by the kind of violence that modern war had become. There's also something almost tragic in the fact that the man who spent so much of his life being remade by new allegiances ended as a missing soldier under the American flag. He had crossed borders, identities, and institutions, and each time he was never fully settled. He kept moving because movement was the only thing he trusted. In Vietnam, movement became fatal. The mission absorbed him, and the jungle kept him. What remains after that is memory. And memory is where Thorne becomes more than a historical curiosity. He becomes a case study in what war can do to a human life when war is not just one event, but the central force of the person's development. He was forged by Finland, hardened by conflict, reshaped by defeat, hidden by reinvention, and finally consumed by a war on the far side of the world. That is not a normal life. It is a life that reveals how the 20th century could take a man and keep pulling him deeper until the only stable identity left was the soldier. His story also leaves behind a difficult question that does not need an easy answer. Was he a patriot, a collaborator, an exile, a survivor, a professional soldier, or a man who never found peace because peace was never what he knew how to live in? The honest answer is that he was all of those things at different times, and none of them fully explain him alone. That is why his life still works as a story. It refuses simplification. It stays alive because it remains morally and psychologically unresolved. And maybe that is the most fitting ending possible. Larry Thorne did not leave behind a perfect legacy. He left behind a life that is hard to categorize, hard to excuse, and impossible to ignore. He ended in a helicopter over Vietnam, but the real ending was everything that came before it. The Finnish winter, the German war years, the escape, the reinvention, the American Special Forces career, and the long chain of decisions that kept turning one soldier into another. He was never one man for long. History kept remaking him until it finally took him completely.